the months leading up to June 6, 1944, the Allied High Command developed one of the most ambitious invasion plans in military history, Operation Overlord. Within that larger operation, the airborne component was known as Operation Neptune, designed to secure key bridges, roads, and causeways inland from the Normandy beaches before the amphibious assault began. The plan relied on American, British, and Canadian airborne divisions landing behind enemy lines in the early hours of D-Day. Their task was to disrupt German reinforcements, destroy communication lines, and hold vital terrain until seaborne forces arrived. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were assigned to drop in the Cotentin Peninsula, west of Utah Beach. The British 6th Airborne Division would land east of the River Orne, near Caen. For the Americans, success required precise navigation over darkened, hostile territory and coordinated drops across multiple zones. However, despite months of training and planning, numerous flaws existed in how the airborne operations were conceived, coordinated, and executed. The first critical issue was the underestimation of the complexity of night navigation over occupied France. The Pathfinders, specially trained paratroopers who were supposed to mark landing zones with radar beacons and signal lights, were expected to guide hundreds of transport aircraft flying in formation. But the plan assumed near-perfect visibility and minimal interference. Intelligence reports underestimated how the Normandy weather and German defenses would complicate the approach. Heavy clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and the need for blackout conditions meant that pilots had almost no visual references once they crossed the French coast. Another fundamental problem came from the rapid expansion and uneven experience of the air transport crews. Many of the pilots of the C-47 Skytrains belonged to the US-9 Troop Carrier Command. Although they had undergone intensive flight training, many had limited combat experience and had never flown large formation missions under fire. In contrast, some units had veterans of North Africa or Sicily, but the inconsistency across squadrons created reliability gaps. The airborne plan demanded hundreds of aircraft flying in close formation at night, each expected to release paratroopers at precise coordinates. It was a plan that left no margin for human or environmental error. The terrain of Normandy presented another overlooked challenge. Much of the Cotentin Peninsula was low-lying farmland bordered by hedgerows and intersected by narrow causeways. Allied intelligence maps did not fully account for the deliberate flooding carried out by German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. To hinder airborne and amphibious landings, German engineers had opened floodgates along the Douve and Merderet rivers, submerging thousands of acres of fields and pastures. Many of these areas turned into shallow lakes, often several feet deep. Although aerial reconnaissance photos showed signs of flooding, planners assumed it was limited to certain sectors. They did not alter the drop zones or prepare the airborne units for the scale of inundation. Communication and coordination between the airborne command and naval ground planners were also imperfect. The airborne operation was treated as a supporting effort to the beach landings rather than an independent phase requiring distinct contingencies. This perspective influenced resource allocation, particularly in radar and navigation equipment. The British Pathfinder units received advanced Rebecca Eureka radar sets, while many American Pathfinders had older models with shorter ranges and higher malfunction rates. Moreover, the flight paths for American troop carriers required them to cross the channel at low altitude to avoid radar detection and enemy fighters, which increased fuel consumption and reduced flexibility during the drop. Intelligence estimates also underplayed the density of German anti-aircraft defenses around the Cotentin area. Many of the American drop zones lay within range of multiple flak batteries positioned to defend the Cherbourg approaches. Reports had identified several known emplacements, but analysts concluded that the guns were older models with limited reach. In reality, the Germans had upgraded many with 20mm and 88mm cannons, capable of accurate fire against low-flying aircraft. When the C-47 formations approached Normandy, they entered intense barrages of flak that forced pilots to take evasive maneuvers, throwing off flight formations and scattering aircraft miles from their intended drop zones. The choice of nighttime insertion was another double-edged decision. On paper, it offered surprise and protection from enemy fighters. However, it also drastically reduced situational awareness. The airborne divisions had trained extensively for night operations in England, but under controlled conditions. In actual combat, the combination of darkness, ground haze, and anti-aircraft fire led to chaos. Many pilots released paratroopers too early or too late. Some, fearing collisions with other aircraft or enemy fire, climbed or descended abruptly, further confusing paratroopers about their altitude and location. The equipment load assigned to each paratrooper added to the coming disaster. Soldiers carried upwards of 100 pounds of gear, including rifles, ammunition, grenades, radios, and demolition charges. In some units, heavy bundles were attached to the men with quick-release straps, but others lacked standardized harnesses. The weight was considered necessary for extended operations behind enemy lines, but it made survival in a water landing nearly impossible. Even before takeoff, some officers expressed concern about the excessive loads, especially after reports from practice jumps in England showed multiple injuries during heavy landings. These warnings were noted but largely ignored, as commanders prioritized readiness for sustained ground combat once the men regrouped. Coordination between the Pathfinder aircraft and main troop carriers also suffered from poor timing. Pathfinders were supposed to drop roughly 30 minutes ahead of the main force to activate visual and radar beacons. However, due to weather delays and navigational confusion, many Pathfinder teams either missed their zones or were neutralized shortly after landing. As a result, many transport aircraft arrived over Normandy without clear drop signals. Pilots had to make quick judgments based on limited visibility, often mistaking rivers or flooded fields for open farmland. A further planning error came from the inadequate briefing of pilots and paratroopers about terrain conditions. Maps issued to the airborne divisions did not clearly indicate which areas were likely to be flooded. The American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions expected mostly firm pasture land suitable for glider and parachute drops. Instead, large portions of the designated DZs, drop zones, near Saint-Mère-Église and the Meurthe River, were under several feet of water. Many of these flooded zones were bordered by hedgerows and ditches that acted as traps, preventing movement once paratroopers landed. The final review of the Airborne Plan, held in late May 1944 at Allied headquarters in England, gave little indication that senior commanders grasped the full extent of the risks. Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton, commanding the 9th Troop Carrier Command, acknowledged the possibility of scattered drops, but argued that the training and discipline of airborne troops would overcome it. General Dwight D. Eisenhower approved the plan, emphasizing the importance of coordination and timing over terrain detail. The assumption was that, even with disorganization, the paratroopers' morale and initiative would compensate for errors. On the German side, the 15th Army and 7th Army continued strengthening the Atlantic Wall defenses. Rommel's strategy of flooding low-lying areas, while designed primarily to counter glider landings, ended up directly affecting the American drops. His engineers used pumps and sluices to redirect water from nearby rivers, turning the Meurthe Valley into an artificial swamp. Reconnaissance units observed these changes but underestimated their impact, viewing them as minor obstacles rather than extensive inundation. No serious adjustment was made to the flight. or drop plans, even after final reconnaissance photos showed reflections and darkened patches consistent with flooding. The planning process also suffered from compartmentalization. Different branches operated with limited cross-communication. Airborne commanders focused on tactical objectives, while air transport officers concentrated on timing and routes. Few had the authority to alter the plan comprehensively. Consequently, the mission went forward with critical assumptions unverified. For instance, no pre-drop reconnaissance by special operations teams was approved to confirm ground conditions in the Cotentin area, a step that might have revealed the flooded terrain. By early June 1944, the airborne operation had become a massive logistical effort involving over 800 aircraft and thousands of men. Despite its size, the underlying structure depended on precision that was nearly impossible to achieve under wartime conditions. Weather reports predicted low cloud cover and moderate winds. Yet these warnings were accepted as tolerable risks. The decision to proceed was made largely because delaying the invasion again would disrupt the synchronized naval and ground assaults planned for dawn. In summary, the foundation of the coming disaster was laid well before a single aircraft took off. The combination of inadequate intelligence on terrain conditions, inexperienced transport crews, over-reliance on technical aids, and underestimation of German defenses made the airborne phase extremely vulnerable. What appeared to be a bold and necessary pre-invasion strike was in fact a fragile plan dependent on near-perfect execution. The miscalculations in navigation, weather, and flood assessment turned the night of June 5th to 6th into a prelude to unnecessary tragedy. By the time the first transport formations left England, the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions believed they were heading into a precise operation, guided by months of careful planning. In reality, many of the critical variables, weather, visibility, terrain, and coordination, were already working against them. The decisions made in the planning rooms of England ensured that, even before they reached Normandy, hundreds of paratroopers were heading toward fatal drop zones they would never survive. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the first phase of the Allied invasion of Normandy began in darkness. Between midnight and 2:30 a.m., hundreds of C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft carried paratroopers of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions across the English Channel. Their mission was to secure key bridges, causeways, and crossroads behind Utah Beach, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the coast once the main amphibious assault began. Each C-47 carried around 18 paratroopers. Many aircraft also towed Waco and Horsa gliders filled with jeeps, anti-tank guns, and additional troops. The takeoffs from airfields in southern England began shortly after 10:30 p.m. on June 5th. Pilots flew in large, tight formations across the channel under blackout conditions to avoid detection. The weather was poor. Thick cloud cover and strong winds reduced visibility. Despite forecasts warning of turbulence, the operation proceeded as scheduled because the invasion could not be delayed further. The first formations approached the Cotentin Peninsula shortly before 1 a.m. German radar had already detected the incoming aircraft, and anti-aircraft batteries opened fire as soon as the first planes crossed the coastline. The flak over the western sector near Cotentin and Saint-Mère-Église was particularly intense. Many C-47s were hit, forcing pilots to take evasive action or release paratroopers early. The tightly packed formations quickly broke apart, and units became scattered across a wide area. The Pathfinder teams, who had been dropped 30 minutes earlier to mark the drop zones with signal lights and radar beacons, failed to establish reliable markers. Many Pathfinders landed far from their intended zones or were killed and captured soon after landing. As a result, The majority of the main force had no visible or radio guidance when they reached Normandy airspace. Pilots had to rely on visual landmarks, but heavy clouds and German searchlights made this nearly impossible. The planned drop altitude for the paratroopers was around 600 to 700 feet. Under fire and disoriented, many pilots flew much lower, some as low as 300 feet. Others climbed higher to avoid flak, releasing troops from altitudes that scattered them even further. At such low heights, paratroopers had almost no time for parachutes to fully deploy. Some were killed instantly upon impact. Others survived the jump, but landed directly in the flooded zones west of the Meurderette River and south of Saint-Mère-Église. German forces under General Wilhelm Falle of the 91st Infantry Division had previously flooded these areas by opening floodgates along the Douve and Meurderette rivers. The water spread across fields, meadows, and roads, creating expanses of shallow lakes bordered by hedgerows and ditches. The depth varied between 2 and 10 feet. At night, the water surfaces were indistinguishable from solid ground. Many paratroopers believed they were landing in grassy fields. When they hit the water, the weight of their equipment pulled them under immediately. A standard American paratrooper carried a rifle or carbine, a reserve chute, an equipment pack, ammunition, grenades, a knife, and often a radio or demolition charge. The full load averaged 80 to 100 pounds. When dropped into water, even waist deep, this weight became lethal. The quick-release straps designed for emergency detachment often jammed under pressure or became tangled in suspension lines. In many cases, men who landed in 4 feet of water drowned within seconds. Reports from surviving paratroopers described the scene as one of instant chaos. In the darkness, soldiers could hear cries for help but could not locate one another. The sound of small arms fire, machine guns, and the continuing anti-aircraft barrage added to the confusion. Some paratroopers attempted to cut themselves free using trench knives, but many could not reach their harnesses in time. The flooded fields also contained submerged fences and hedgerows that trapped parachutes, pulling men under as they tried to swim. The 82nd Airborne Division's 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments suffered particularly high losses in the flooded areas near the Meurderette River. Entire sticks of paratroopers, groups dropped from a single aircraft, were lost within minutes of landing. The 5007's drop zones, DZT and DZN, were almost entirely underwater. Survivors later described seeing dozens of parachutes floating on the surface with no movement below them. In some sectors, more than half the men who jumped drowned before firing a shot. At La Fière, near the bridge over the Meurderette, one of the key objectives for the 82nd, only small groups managed to assemble. Major Frederick Kellum of the 508 was among those who drowned shortly after landing. Many others became entangled in trees or hedgerows, unable to release their gear in time to move. The heavy packs, designed for sustained operations, proved deadly in the conditions they faced. The 101st Airborne Division, tasked with securing causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, encountered similar problems in its southern sector near Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Although fewer of its drop zones were flooded, the division's transport aircraft were equally disorganized by flak and weather. Hundreds of men were dropped miles from their assigned areas. But those who landed near the Douve River found themselves in deep water. Company A of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment lost numerous men to drowning before reaching solid ground. The glider operations that followed also met with disaster. Many gliders were released too early or at the wrong altitude. With little visibility and no clear landing fields, dozens crashed into trees, flooded meadows, or hedgerows. The men inside had no protection from impact. Casualties were severe. Glider pilots later reported that waterlogged ground offered no braking resistance, causing gliders to skid and flip on contact. Equipment, jeeps, and guns were destroyed or sunk. German ground troops quickly realized that paratroopers were landing in the area and began firing into the darkness. Many Americans who had survived the jump were killed while still trying to cut free from their parachutes. Others drowned under fire while attempting to crawl out of ditches or flooded fields. The combination of heavy gear, lack of light, and unfamiliar terrain left them with no means of defense. By 2 a.m., most of the C-47 formations had completed their drops. The result was a widespread dispersion of units across nearly 25 miles of countryside. Commanders had little to no contact with their troops. The intended coordinated assault on bridges, roads, and causeways became impossible. In some areas, only small patrol-sized groups managed to gather. Many men landed completely alone and spent hours trying to orient themselves. The most tragic aspect of the night was the sheer number of preventable drownings. Post-operation surveys found that in the Meurthe River Valley and Douve floodplain, hundreds of paratroopers had died without enemy engagement. Recovery teams later discovered bodies still strapped to parachutes, rifles slung across their backs, entangled in hedgerows or submerged fences. Many were found in positions indicating they had struggled to remove their equipment. At dawn, the rising light revealed the extent of the loss. The flooded fields were littered with parachutes, glider wreckage, and floating equipment. Some surviving paratroopers who had managed to reach solid ground waded back into the water to recover comrades. But the depth and cold made rescue almost impossible. The first daylight reconnaissance flights confirmed the dispersal. Instead of concentrated airborne zones, small clusters of troops were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. The lack of coordination among aircraft formations also contributed to friendly fire incidents. Some transport planes, disoriented and off course, flew over Allied naval vessels that mistook them for enemy aircraft. Several C-47s were hit by anti-aircraft fire from Allied ships. Others crashed while attempting to return to England, damaged from flak or overloaded with paratroopers who had refused to jump into flooded or heavily defended zones. In total, the U.S. Airborne forces lost more than 1,200 men killed or missing during the initial night of the D-Day operation, with several hundred confirmed drownings in the flooded areas west of Saint-Mère-Église. These were casualties sustained before any organized combat had begun. The majority occurred in a region where German units played little role in inflicting the damage. Despite the confusion and the heavy losses, a few groups succeeded in reaching their objectives. Elements of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment managed to capture Saint-Mère-Église before dawn, making it the first town in France liberated by the Allies. But these localized successes could not conceal the overall breakdown of the airborne plan. The intended large-scale coordination between the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions never materialized. Commanders spent much of June 6th trying to locate their dispersed units and re-establish communication. For the paratroopers who survived the drops, the aftermath was grim. Many had lost their weapons and radios in the water. Equipment bundles meant to supply them had landed miles away. Without maps or landmarks, orientation was almost impossible in the dark, flooded countryside. Some survivors spent hours wading through waist-deep water before finding dry ground or joining other scattered soldiers. German troops later reported finding dozens of American bodies in the flooded zones in the days following the landings. Local French civilians also assisted in recovery efforts once fighting moved inland. The bodies of many drowned paratroopers were retrieved from ditches, ponds, and submerged roads. The full extent of the losses in these specific sectors became clear only after the war, when U.S. graves registration teams documented the concentration of drownings in the Meurthe Valley. The night of June 6, 1944, demonstrated the dangers of combining complex airborne operations with incomplete intelligence and poor environmental assessment. The tragedy that unfolded was not the result of combat failure, but of planning miscalculations and execution under impossible conditions. Hundreds of highly trained soldiers died not in battle, but in flooded fields they were never supposed to encounter. Their mission objectives remained unfulfilled for hours as surviving paratroopers struggled simply to stay alive and regroup. By dawn, the airborne phase of the D-Day invasion had cost more lives than any other single component of the opening hours. The sight of parachutes hanging from trees and bodies floating in the fields west of Saint-Mère-Église became a grim reminder of how flawed planning and unpredictable conditions turned a crucial military operation into a scene of unnecessary loss. The extensive flooding of the Cotentin lowlands in 1944 was not the result of natural conditions, but a deliberate military strategy implemented by German occupation forces in the months leading up to D-Day. Under the supervision of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, German engineers had transformed the landscape into a defensive barrier designed to restrict Allied airborne and amphibious movements. These artificially created floods played a decisive and deadly role during the American airborne operations of June 6, 1944. The Cotentin Peninsula contained wide expanses of farmland, crisscrossed by the Meurthe and Douve rivers, and divided by hedgerows, dikes, and causeways. These low-lying areas had always been prone to seasonal flooding. But beginning in late 1943, the German 91st Infantry Division and attached engineer units began systematically manipulating the region's waterways. Their goal was to create impassable terrain zones to block paratrooper landings and glider operations. German engineers opened sluice gates along the Douves River near Cotentin and used pumps to divert water into adjacent fields. They also constructed earthen dams and blocked drainage ditches, ensuring that rainwater and river overflow remained trapped. The plan was to create shallow lakes and marshlands stretching across miles of farmland. By May 1944, much of the land between the Meurthe River and the Douve floodplain had been transformed into a waterlogged defensive zone. Aerial reconnaissance photos taken by Allied intelligence before D-Day showed dark, reflective surfaces in these areas. But the extent of the flooding was not accurately measured. Analysts believed the water to be only a few inches deep, insufficient to prevent troop landings. This assessment proved critically wrong. In reality, large sections west of Saint-Mère-Église, including the areas designated as drop zones for the 82nd Airborne Division, were submerged under 2 to 6 feet of water. Some depressions and ditches were even deeper. The 91st Infantry Division, which held this sector, used the flooded terrain to strengthen its defensive positions. The Germans placed machine gun nests and mortar emplacements on elevated ground, knowing that the surrounding water would slow or trap attackers. Bridges and causeways across the Meurthe and Douve were mined and pre-sighted for artillery fire. These measures were effective against both ground and airborne forces. When the American paratroopers of the 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments were dropped over this area on the night of June 6th, they found themselves landing directly into the flooded zone. The flooding covered more than 30 square kilometers between Amfreville, La Fière, Chef du Pont, and Picoville. The water concealed fences, ditches, and hedgerows that acted as barriers once the men hit the surface. Many were trapped by parachutes that filled with water or became tangled in submerged vegetation. Eyewitness accounts from survivors describe how the floods turned the landscape into a lethal environment. Paratroopers landed thinking they were on solid ground, only to sink waist-deep or chest-deep in water. The average soldier carried around 100 pounds of gear, including weapons, ammunition, rations, and demolition tools. The load that had been manageable on dry land became fatal in water. Those who could not immediately release their harnesses drowned within moments. The Meurthe River Valley was particularly deadly because of its irregular depth and network of hidden ditches. The Germans had allowed water to collect unevenly, so some areas were knee-deep while others plunged to over 8 feet. Soldiers attempting to wade toward higher ground suddenly found themselves submerged. The low visibility at night compounded the danger, as paratroopers could not see where they were stepping or which direction led to safety. The La Fière Bridge area became one of the worst drowning zones. The fields surrounding the causeway were completely flooded. Men from the 507th and 508th Regiments landed all around it, with many never making it out of the water. Later reports from engineers and medics who surveyed the area indicated that entire sticks, groups of 15 to 18 men, had perished without reaching solid ground. The concentration of parachutes in the water indicated where transport aircraft had dropped them too low or too far from the intended zone. The Germans had not anticipated that the flooding would kill so many paratroopers, but the effect served their defensive purpose even better than planned. The water prevented Allied forces from assembling quickly and delayed their efforts to seize key crossings. The causeways over the Douve and Meurthe rivers became choke points, heavily defended by German troops. Those few Americans who managed to reach dry ground faced immediate small arms fire from higher positions. Recovery and rescue were nearly impossible during the night of June 6th. The sound of gunfire, artillery, and aircraft drowned out calls for help. Paratroopers who tried to rescue drowning comrades risked becoming trapped themselves. Some men attempted to use their parachutes as flotation aids, but the wet silk fabric provided little buoyancy. A few survivors managed to reach hedgerow banks or trees and cling to them until daylight. Others cut away their equipment underwater and swam for several minutes before finding shallower ground. At dawn, the flooded fields revealed the full scale of the losses. Parachutes floated across the water, attached to motionless bodies. Equipment bundles and weapons crates were scattered across the surface or partially submerged. In some areas, gliders had also crashed into the flooded zones, sinking rapidly upon impact. The waterlogged terrain made it impossible to recover supplies or regroup effectively. Soldiers who had survived the initial drop now faced the problem of crossing miles of flooded land under fire to reach their objectives. The engineering details of the German flooding system reveal its deliberate and systematic nature. The 709th and 243rd Infantry Division, stationed to the north, had previously conducted similar flooding operations along the eastern Cotentin coast. Rommel expanded this tactic when he took command of Army Group B in late 1943. He viewed the Cotentin wetlands as natural anti-airborne defenses and ordered the construction of additional barriers to expand the inundated zones. German field reports from April 1944 indicated that Nassau water levels are sufficient to prevent glider landings and hinder parachutists. These reports underestimated the depth variations, but confirmed that the Germans intended the area to be hazardous. The German troops positioned around Picoville and Amfreville used the flooded fields as part of their tactical advantage. Patrols could move along dikes and causeways, firing on any movement in the water below. The 13th Parachute Regiment of the 91st Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, exploited the elevated ground to contain isolated paratrooper groups. Von der Heydt later remarked that the Americans seemed to appear from the water itself, an observation that reflected how the flooding concealed troop landings until the moment of contact. In operational terms, the flooding nullified much of the Airborne Division's tactical training. The paratroopers had been trained for rapid assembly and aggressive movement upon landing. The flooded fields eliminated those options, Instead of organizing platoons or companies, men struggled individually to stay alive. Radios and maps were lost in the water, destroying unit coordination. Many paratroopers who reached dry land had no idea where they were, as familiar terrain features like roads and farm boundaries were submerged. The consequences extended beyond the initial drownings. The flooded terrain delayed the consolidation of airborne forces for several critical hours. Bridges at La Fière and Chef du Pont were supposed to be captured early to block German reinforcements. Because so many units were scattered or lost in the floods, only small groups reached these objectives on time. The 82nd Airborne's 505th Regiment, which landed slightly east of the worst flooded zones, bore the brunt of holding the crossings until reinforcements arrived. The loss of personnel in the floods also reduced the availability of specialized soldiers, including engineers and radio operators, who were essential for establishing communication with the beachhead. Without them, coordination between airborne and seaborne forces suffered, complicating the Utah beach advance later in the morning. Post-war analysis of the Cotentin flooding provided more detailed insight into its extent. Surveys conducted by U.S. Army engineers in July 1944 estimated that approximately 25 square kilometers of the 82nd Airborne's operational area were submerged at depths exceeding 3 feet. The flooded regions near Amfreville, Gorbesville, and Etienneville remained impassable for vehicles even weeks after D-Day. Many of the dikes and sluice gates were destroyed only after ground forces captured the area. German documentation captured after the war confirmed that the flooding was part of a broader defensive plan known as the Wasserhindernislinie, water obstacle line. The purpose was to deny access to low-lying terrain and force Allied paratroopers into predictable approach routes along elevated causeways, where they could be targeted more easily. Rommel's directive, issued on April 15, 1944, explicitly mentioned maintaining water levels in the Meurthe Basin at a height sufficient to make troop movement impossible. Unit-level losses demonstrate the scale of the disaster. The 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment reported that out of 2,000 men dropped, only about 1,000 could be accounted for by noon on June 6th. Many of the missing were later confirmed drowned. The 508th Regiment suffered similar attrition, particularly in battalions dropped west of the Meurthe River. The 1st Battalion of the 507th, assigned to secure the La Fière Bridge, lost an estimated 20% of its strength in the floods alone before engaging any enemy forces. Even the glider units were affected. The 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, scheduled to land on D-Day +1, found its designated landing zones still partially flooded when it arrived. Several gliders sank upon landing, resulting in further casualties and loss of equipment. The environmental and logistical challenges of the flooded fields persisted for days. The water delayed the movement of supplies and artillery across the Cotentin Peninsula. Engineers had to construct makeshift bridges and pump out roads before heavy vehicles could pass. The Meurthe Valley remained a waterlogged obstacle well into late June, influencing the tempo of the advance toward Cherbourg. The flooding also created sanitation problems as bodies and debris accumulated in the stagnant water. U.S. medical units reported difficulty retrieving casualties due to submerged terrain and ongoing sniper fire. In some sectors, it took more than a week before the last drowned paratroopers were recovered. The German flooding of the Cotentin lowlands thus became one of the most effective defensive measures employed in Normandy, even though it was never intended to kill so many paratroopers. The combination of deliberate inundation, poor Allied reconnaissance, and the circumstances of the night drop transformed the region into a vast, hidden trap. The losses suffered in these fields directly affected the strength and coordination of American airborne forces during the critical first 24 hours of the Normandy campaign. By creating an environment that neutralized the paratroopers' mobility, the Germans achieved a temporary but devastating tactical success. Hundreds of American soldiers died not through enemy fire, but through the environmental manipulation of the battlefield. The flooded lowlands of the Cotentin Peninsula stand as one of the most striking examples of terrain being turned into a weapon during World War II. When the airborne drops over Normandy concluded in the early hours of June 6, 1944, the full extent of the mist drops and confusion became clear. The surviving paratroopers who had not drowned or been injured upon landing found themselves scattered across miles of countryside, often miles away from their designated drop zones. Many men from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed alone or in small, disorganized groups, isolated in unfamiliar terrain under heavy enemy fire. The plan had depended on cohesive units forming quickly to seize key bridges, crossroads, and towns. Instead, much of the airborne force spent critical hours trying to determine their own location, with many never managing to regroup at all. The situation in the Cotentin Peninsula was chaotic. Each battalion had been assigned precise objectives: Saint-Mère-Église for the 82nd Airborne, the causeways behind Utah Beach for the 101st, and key road junctions leading inland from the beaches. These objectives were designed to secure routes for the seaborne landings at dawn. But with drop zones missed by miles, many paratroopers found themselves in areas still under firm German control. Communications equipment, already limited, was largely lost in the drops. Radio operators landed far from command groups, and many radios were destroyed upon impact or submerged in water. As a result, coordination between scattered units was almost non-existent. Officers quickly realized that large-scale organization was impossible. Small groups of 2, 5, or 10 men began operating independently, guided by the sound of distant gunfire and their own compasses. In many cases, soldiers moved cautiously through hedgerows and villages, avoiding confrontation unless necessary. Others stumbled directly into German patrols. The terrain of Normandy, with its maze of bocage fields, high hedgerows, and narrow lanes, made navigation extremely difficult even in daylight. And these men were operating in darkness or in the first light of dawn. The Germans, particularly elements of the 709th and 91st Infantry Divisions, quickly recognized the disorganized state of the landings. Patrols were sent out to capture or eliminate isolated paratroopers. Many American soldiers were ambushed while attempting to link up with others. Small skirmishes broke out across the countryside, often between handfuls of men on both sides. These engagements were deadly and brief. With no clear direction, no heavy weapons, and limited ammunition, many American paratroopers were outmatched by better-positioned German defenders. The 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne experienced some of the worst disorganization. Intended to drop west of the Mer River, many of its paratroopers landed east of it or directly in the flooded lowlands. Survivors who managed to reach higher ground found themselves isolated. Captain Roy Creekmore and his small group, for instance, were trapped for nearly 2 days in marshes near Amfreville before making contact with another American patrol. Similar experiences were reported across multiple units. Days passed before even partial regrouping occurred. In many areas, German machine gun nests had been set up near bridges and crossroads, the exact points the Americans had been ordered to seize. Without coordination, these objectives remained out of reach for many units well into June 7th. The 101st Airborne faced similar difficulties. Many of its paratroopers landed far from the designated drop zones near Cotentin and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, whose battalion was assigned to clear the causeways from Utah Beach, had only a fraction of his men available by sunrise. He improvised with whoever he could find, combining soldiers from different regiments into ad hoc groups. Despite their small numbers, these mixed groups managed to complete some missions, but at a heavy cost. Individual initiative became the only strategy available. German units, confused at first by the scale of the airborne landings, gradually took advantage of the Allied disorder. Local commanders ordered artillery and machine gun fire on suspected assembly points. Many paratroopers were killed attempting to move through open terrain or across flooded causeways. Even when groups managed to reach each other, they often lacked the necessary equipment. Heavy weapons, radios, and medical supplies had been dropped separately and were rarely recovered. Several paratroop medics reported that their aid stations were established with almost no supplies, relying on captured German equipment. The scattered condition also led to friendly fire incidents. Paratroopers often mistook other American groups for German patrols, especially at night when identifying markers were lost or covered by mud. Reports from the 82nd Airborne mention multiple cases where small groups exchanged fire before realizing they were on the same side. These errors added to the casualties and further reduced morale. By morning, only fragmented elements of most regiments were in any kind of operational formation. Instead of battalions numbering hundreds, many commanders had a few dozen men at best. Despite this, the paratroopers continued to engage where they could, cutting telephone lines, ambushing German convoys, and securing small villages. Their scattered attacks still caused confusion in German ranks, preventing a coordinated counterattack against the beach landings. But for the individual soldiers on the ground, the lack of organization turned every engagement into a desperate, isolated fight for survival. In several villages across Normandy, such as Saint-Mère-Église, Picauville, and Grain, small groups of airborne soldiers held out against superior German forces. At Grain, members of the 507th and 501st Parachute Infantry Regiments, numbering fewer than 200, established a defensive perimeter with the help of local civilians. For 2 days, they fought off elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division before being overrun. Nearly all were killed or executed after capture. These isolated engagements underscored the human cost of disarray. Each pocket of resistance was formed by men who had landed far from their intended positions, acting independently to survive and fight. In the area around Saint-Mère-Église, paratroopers who managed to regroup under Colonel Roy Lindquist and Brigadier General James Gavin formed the core of the 82nd Airborne's first defensive line. They repelled multiple German counterattacks on June 6th and 7th. However, even these successes came at the cost of heavy casualties. The disorganized start had deprived them of reinforcements and supplies, forcing them to hold positions with limited ammunition. Further south, around Cotentin, the 101st faced persistent difficulties, consolidating its scattered companies. Many men remained missing for days, either captured or still attempting to navigate through the hedgerows. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment reported that some paratroopers did not rejoin their units until nearly a week after the landings. Others were never accounted for. German records indicate numerous small engagements where they captured small groups of American paratroopers, often numbering fewer than 10. The human toll of the confusion extended beyond combat. Many men suffered exhaustion and dehydration after wandering for hours through flooded terrain. Some succumbed to exposure or wounds sustained during the landing. Medics operating without supplies were forced to leave the wounded behind when German patrols approached. Civilians who attempted to help were often caught in crossfire or punished by occupying forces once discovered. The confusion also affected command decisions. Senior officers struggled to determine the scale of their own forces and the enemy's response. Reports were inconsistent or non-existent. The 82nd Airborne's headquarters did not receive accurate information about unit positions until well into June 7th. As a result, requests for artillery or air support were delayed or misdirected. Even when reinforcements arrived from seaborne units, coordination remained difficult because initial objectives had not been secured as planned. Despite the heavy losses, scattered groups continued to contribute to the broader invasion by disrupting German communications and reinforcements. However, these actions did not diminish the scale of the unnecessary deaths caused by poor coordination. Dozens of small engagements, ambushes, and failed regrouping efforts resulted in high casualties among airborne troops. The paratroopers' bravery and persistence could not compensate for the structural and planning failures that had placed them in such a position. By the end of June 6th, thousands of paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Divisions were still unaccounted for. Many had been killed in isolated skirmishes, drowned in the flooded lowlands, or captured while trying to rejoin their units. The airborne operation achieved partial success only because of the initiative of individuals and small groups. Strategically, it contributed to the overall invasion by tying down German units, but tactically, it demonstrated the immense cost of disarray. The human cost of the airborne drops in Normandy went far beyond the drowned paratroopers of the early hours. Those who survived faced isolation, ambushes, and confusion that claimed hundreds more lives unnecessarily. The combination of flawed coordination, poor communication, and misjudged drop zones ensured that the path to the D-Day objectives was paid for with preventable sacrifice. In the weeks following the Allied landings in Normandy, the extent of the airborne losses began to emerge through reports compiled by field officers and division headquarters. Initial assessments from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions documented not only the high number of casualties, but also the disorganization and operational failures that had contributed to unnecessary deaths. Many of the reports emphasized that while the overall strategic objectives of the airborne operations were achieved, the human cost had been far higher than anticipated, and a large portion of those losses had not come from enemy action, but from preventable causes such as missed drops, equipment failures, and flooding. By late June 1944, casualty figures revealed that both divisions had suffered significant losses. The 82nd Airborne reported nearly 1,260 killed, missing, or wounded in the first 10 days of operations. The 101st Airborne recorded over 1,200 casualties during the same period. Of these, hundreds had been lost before engaging the enemy, drowned in flooded fields, crushed under heavy loads, or killed in scattered skirmishes caused by poor coordination. Commanders quickly recognized that the causes were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of systemic flaws in the planning and execution of the airborne phase of Operation Overlord. Post-mission debriefs were conducted across airborne units. Officers from each regiment submitted detailed accounts of what had gone wrong. These reports consistently highlighted several key issues. First, the drop altitudes had been dangerously low. Many transport pilots, inexperienced in night combat conditions, flew below 600 feet, making it impossible for paratroopers to properly deploy their chutes or prepare for landing. Second, poor navigation and the loss of formation during heavy anti-aircraft fire had caused widespread scattering. Crews often misidentified landmarks or released their sticks too early or too late. Finally, intelligence on German defensive preparations, particularly the deliberate flooding of the Cotentin lowlands, had been incomplete. Many drop zones designated as suitable landing areas had, by the night of June 6th, become shallow lakes or marshes filled with obstacles. A U.S. Army Air Forces assessment conducted in July 1944 directly addressed the role of the transport units. It concluded that while many pilots had performed under extreme conditions, the overall execution of the airborne drops had been inconsistent and insufficiently coordinated. The report noted that some air crews had never flown at night or under fire before D-Day. Training had emphasized navigation in clear conditions, but had not adequately prepared crews for the level of German resistance encountered. The lack of standardized flight procedures, especially regarding drop altitudes and speeds, led to significant variation across formations. Commanders acknowledged that better synchronization between ground planning and air execution could have reduced the level of chaos. The airborne divisions themselves conducted internal reviews. The 101st Airborne's after-action report described the flooding as a contributing factor of primary importance in the loss of men and equipment. The document estimated that several hundred paratroopers had drowned within minutes of landing. The report also identified that in many cases, paratroopers had jumped with excessively heavy loads, often exceeding 100 pounds of equipment, which made it almost impossible to swim or even stand in deep water. The inclusion of full field packs, reserve parachutes, ammunition, and demolition gear had turned water landings into fatal situations. The report recommended future reductions in load weights and more specialized waterproofing of equipment. The 82nd Airborne's evaluation echoed these findings. Its officers concluded that the scattering of troops had been catastrophic to the initial operational plans. Some units, such as the 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments, had been rendered ineffective for nearly 48 hours due to misdrops and casualties in flooded terrain. The division also noted that communication failures played a major role. Of the radio sets dropped with each battalion, only a fraction were recovered and operational. The remainder were lost in water or damaged on impact. The resulting lack of coordination magnified the confusion on the ground and increased the exposure of small, isolated groups to ambushes and capture. Higher command took these reports seriously. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, senior planners reviewed the airborne operation as part of a broader analysis of D-Day outcomes. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's staff concluded that, while the airborne operations had succeeded in their strategic purpose of disrupting German defenses and securing critical junctions, the losses were heavier than necessary and largely preventable. Specific blame was not officially assigned, but internal memoranda circulated among staff officers identified several contributing factors: insufficient reconnaissance of terrain conditions, inadequate coordination between air and ground units, and a failure to account for environmental obstacles such as flooding. British and Canadian airborne operations were also reviewed for comparison. The British 6th Airborne Division, which landed east of the Orne River, experienced similar issues with scattering, but did not face the same level of flooding. Their casualties were substantially lower relative to the American divisions. Analysts later concluded that the difference lay in both geography and planning. The British drop zones were located on higher ground, and reconnaissance had been more thorough. These comparisons reinforced the view that the heavy American airborne losses were not an inevitable consequence of the operation, but rather the result of specific planning oversights in the western sector of Normandy. After the Normandy campaign, the U.S. Army conducted more formal evaluations to extract lessons for future airborne operations. One of the most detailed was compiled by the Airborne Board in August 1944. This report systematically identified the main causes of unnecessary casualties during the Normandy drops. It emphasized the need for accurate intelligence on terrain conditions, more rigorous pilot training for night and low-level navigation, and improved waterproofing and reduction of individual equipment loads. The board also recommended that airborne forces receive clearer contingency plans for misdrops, allowing smaller groups to reorganize and achieve limited objectives rather than becoming disoriented. Individual testimonies from officers and enlisted men added to the understanding of what had gone wrong. Many surviving paratroopers described confusion in the air, chaotic light signals, and the difficulty of identifying landmarks under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Others recalled the shock of landing in deep water and hearing men drown nearby. Their accounts confirmed that the disaster was not a result of poor discipline or cowardice, but of conditions and errors that could have been foreseen and mitigated. These testimonies became part of the historical record, influencing later military studies of airborne warfare. Post-war historians examining the Normandy campaign often revisited these same points. Cornelius Ryan, in his detailed study, The Longest Day, 1959, described the airborne landings as a triumph of bravery and a failure of coordination. Later historians, including Stephen Ambrose and John Keegan, echoed that assessment, emphasizing that the airborne operations succeeded largely because of individual initiative rather than flawless planning. Scholarly analyses published in the decades after the war consistently concluded that many of the early airborne deaths on D-Day, particularly the drownings in the flooded zones, were preventable through better reconnaissance and planning. German military records captured after the war provided further evidence. Reports from the 91st Infantry Division and local Wehrmacht engineering units confirmed that the flooding of the Cotentin lowlands had been deliberate and extensive. German engineers had opened sluice gates and dammed rivers to create wide stretches of impassable terrain designed to slow any Allied advance. These records showed that the flooding was no secret to the local population and that aerial reconnaissance might have detected it earlier. The fact that it did not indicates gaps in Allied intelligence gathering before D-Day. The human cost of these oversights remained significant in the post-war accounting. Many paratroopers who drowned in the early hours of June 6th were listed as missing in action for weeks or months before their bodies were recovered. Temporary cemeteries established in Normandy contained numerous graves marked simply as unknown. It was not until after the war that identification of many victims was completed. Units such as the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment suffered particularly high losses in the flooded areas, with company rosters showing reductions of 40 to 50% in the first day alone. In the years that followed, the U.S. Army Airborne Command incorporated the lessons of Normandy into new doctrine. Training programs were revised to include more realistic night navigation exercises, better inter-service coordination, and the development of specialized Pathfinder teams equipped with radar beacons to mark accurate drop zones. By the time of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, some of these improvements were in place, though issues with coordination persisted. The reforms directly addressed many of the problems that had caused unnecessary deaths on D-Day, confirming that military leadership recognized the avoidable nature of those losses. The Normandy airborne operations remained a subject of professional military analysis long after the war. U.S. Army field manuals published in the 1950s and 1960s referenced the lessons of June 1944 when defining the principles of airborne deployment. These included precise coordination between air and ground forces, accurate intelligence on terrain and weather conditions, and the critical need to minimize equipment loads for personnel expected to land in unknown environments. The repeated inclusion of these principles reflected the institutional understanding that the early D-Day casualties had provided a costly education in airborne warfare. Decades later, archival research and interviews continued to refine the historical record. Historians found that the combination of heavy equipment, low-altitude drops, and unrecognized flooding created a perfect sequence of failures. Each mistake compounded the next. The decisions made in the planning phase, including the selection of drop zones and the reliance on limited reconnaissance, had set conditions that made the deaths of hundreds of paratroopers almost inevitable once the aircraft reached Normandy. These findings confirmed the early post-war assessments. the losses were not the result of combat necessity, but a preventable operational error. Today, military historians and analysts continue to regard the drowned paratroopers of D-Day as one of the most tragic examples of miscalculated risk in modern airborne warfare. The event demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of large-scale airborne operations. While the paratroopers' courage and determination contributed to the overall success of the invasion, the deaths of so many men before firing a single shot highlighted the consequences of inadequate planning and flawed execution. The official reports, field records, and post-war analyses collectively show that the unnecessary deaths on D-Day were not simply an unfortunate byproduct of war, but a direct outcome of decisions that could have been made differently. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Army had already begun implementing new standards to prevent similar tragedies. The lessons drawn from Normandy's airborne disaster, accurate terrain reconnaissance, proper pilot training, controlled drop altitudes, and reduced equipment loads, became permanent elements of airborne doctrine. These measures ensured that the paratroopers who followed in later operations would face danger, but not the same avoidable fate that had claimed so many lives in the flooded fields of Normandy on June 6, 1944.